Welcome to Sew Very Easy. My name is Laura, and I have found a free pattern that is called Rose Garden. But they're not your average roses. They're a little sort of round looking. It is a free pattern from Riley Blake, and it is an older one, but I am going to put it with some new fabric, and I think you're going to be very surprised on how pretty Rose Garden will turn out to be. So the free pattern that I'm going to use today is from Riley Blake. Now it is an older pattern and it is called Rose Garden. And I think this pattern will look really nice in this new fabric called Picnic Florals. This is also from Riley Blake, and it has a beautiful assortment of large flowers, stripes, polka dots, strawberries, check. It has a great assortment of fun fresh fabrics. Now this quilt does have this border all the way around, and that border are 5-inch squares. So we get to use some pre-cuts. When we look at the four corners, they're white, the same as this background fabric, but I am just going to replace them with one of the charm fabrics. I do want to use as many as I can of that charm pack. So I want to make this first border first, before I cut the background fabric. The reason is I do not want to cut my charm squares. When we get pre-cuts, often they're not exactly 5 inches. So we can trim this down to be an exact 5-inch or use them the way they are. And in this case, I do want to just use them exactly the way they are. So I might need to make an adjustment to this background fabric. The pattern has 7 squares and those 2 corners, 9 squares and the 2 corners. So what I want to do is make 2 strips of 9 and 2 strips of 7 and leave out those corners. I need to get my measurement from that 9 and the 7. So I've gone through my pack. I've taken out the 4 brightest reds, and I'm going to use those as my cornerstones. And that's replacing that white. Whatever seam allowance you use, it's going to be fine as long as you are consistent. So I have both my strip sets for the top and the bottom and for the sides. Now measure them. Your strip will be very close to 32 inches for the top and the bottom, and the longer strip should be close to 41 inches. My large strip set is 41¼ inches, and my smaller measurement is 32 1/8 of an inch. So those are the measurements I am going to use to replace that center fabric. So I've gained 1/8 of an inch and I've gained 1/4 of an inch. So for the pattern, they are using a light aqua. I am going to be using a white tone-on-tone polka dot for that back fabric. So I'm going to cut it to my personal measurement. I'm going to be able to put my strips aside and those 4 cornerstones aside, and I'm going to work on the applique. The stems are going to go in that seam allowance, and that's why I'm going to do the applique first and put the borders on second. So I need to get my applique shapes ready to go. Now this flower has 3 appliques fused on top of each other. I want to have less glue stacked up. So I'm going to cut so there's about 1/4 inch inside of that circle. That will be put away for another project. Now I'm going to iron that on. So I don't have that glue throughout the entire piece. I'm going to have it just around the border. So now I can cut out that shape. And I'm going to do that for all of the circles. If you are going to just do these little rings for appliques, then you're going to be able to use that applique paper just a little bit different. What we're going to be able to do is trace out a piece first. So we have that nice big circle. And then trace B inside of our circle. And then trace C inside of the circle. So I have all 3 of my circles within this one large circle. The lines that we drew are going to be cutting lines. So I want to cut out that big circle just a little bit around the outside, and that will give me A. For that B circle, I want to cut a little bit on the outside. The C, a little bit on the outside. So I'm going to cut out all of those circles, leaving just a little bit of a seam allowance around the outside. And this is where we don't have to be overly fussy. So now I have all of those circles with a little bit of a seam allowance on the outside and a little bit of seam allowance on the inside. And you can always clean this up if you'd like. But this is going to save you some of your heat and bond and your fusible webs. When everything is fused on, I have that big circle, the next size, and the next size. We can now cut them out. So I now just have the adhesive on the outside. And I was able to save all of that fusible web. If you do some careful placement, you're going to be able to get all of the centers and all of the leaves from those leftover 6 little squares, which means they're not all going to be the same, but I think it'll be fun just the same. Now I'm going to be able to take these components and fuse them onto my background fabric. Once they're fused on, we're going to be able to take this to the machine and stitch these down. We can do a buttonhole stitch, or we can do a satin stitch, whatever your favorite stitch is. Once this is all stitched down, give it a good press, and we're going to be ready to put our borders on. Those sides are going to fit perfect because we did cut this the same as our strips, so we can sew on those 2 sides. And then while we're at the machine, we do need to add on the cornerstones, and we're going to add those on to each side of the short strips. The reason we did not sew those cornerstones on the first time was in order for us to get this measurement. That first border is all done. We're going to add a second. Now, because this was not the exact size, chances are this next border will not be as the directions say. The directions have us cut strips of fabric at 2 inches, and they said it should be 50 inches by 44. So we're going to be close to that, but maybe not exact. I'm going to measure the center of the quilt from the top to the bottom. This is the spot that will have stretched the least. So this is going to be the truer measurement. I will put those side borders on first. When those side borders are done, then I'm going to do the same thing, and I'm going to measure the center and get my next measurement. By doing it this way, we're going to make sure that the quilt does lay flat and that the measurements are going to work out for our quilt. Now, before I add on that last border, I want to add on a flange. I think the flange is really going to accent all of these pieces. They're beautiful fabrics, so I really want each one to stand out on its own. So I'm going to make a flange out of this pretty polka dot fabric. I do want to try to find a fabric that reads very close to a solid. So let's start with this flange. We are going to need the length and the width, and we're going to cut the strips of fabric at 1 inch. Once that 1 inch strip has been cut, we're going to take it and press it in half. Take the raw edge, match it up against the raw edge, right up against that top, and stitch that down. Now, I would recommend using a very scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. So you're going to do the 2 long sides first, and then for the top, it's the same thing. We have that 1 inch folded in half, and it's going to start right up at that corner. So you're overlapping this corner. So you have the first corner you're going to stitch down, and the second corner is going to go right together. The flange does not make the quilt bigger, it just adds a little lip all the way around the outside. We're going to continue to measure and put on the borders in the same way. When we stitch over top of this flange, we don't need to do anything special. Just sort of ignore that it's there. We're going to place the fabric down, and this time we're going to stitch that true 1/4 inch. And that way we've stitched over the original seam. And when we do that and fold that back, we have that nice little flange. So it's a little piece that sticks out. It didn't make the quilt any bigger. It just added a little dimension. So we're going to add on those 2 side borders, press this over, measure the center, and put on the top and bottom. And that is all there is to making this quilt. The flange really does add a nice dimension to this corner. And that's how that flange is going to look. So Rose Garden really did turn out nice. I just love those modern looking roses, and the fabric just goes perfect with it. Adding that little bit of a flange around the outside sort of highlighted each of the fabrics on their own, so they didn't blend into the border. I'm going to use a multicolored red, and it's going to really show up all of the red in those flowers. It was a quick project because we did start off with those pre-cut squares, and the flower shapes were very easy to applique. And it turns out to be a perfect quilt for a sunny day. I'll put a link in the description so you can check out Riley Blake's free pattern. And as always, thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. Feel free to subscribe. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and I do have a newsletter. It's all free under Sew Very Easy. And be sure to make every day a Sewtacular day. Bye for now.